8 years living in Oakwood Estates, and I never once had to memorize a single rule from the Homeowners Association. Life flowed in harmony in our tree-lined neighborhood, with clean streets and well-kept houses. My name is James Harrison, 42 years old, a civil engineer, and, until recently, an absolutely anonymous resident. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to get access to more stories like this. I like the peace I found here. My house isn't the biggest or the fanciest, but it has character, especially in the front, where I spent the last few months creating a little garden with native flowers. A modest project that started after I read about the positive impact these plants have on the local ecosystem. Butterflies, hummingbirds, and bees soon turned that dirt patch into an oasis of life. Everything changed when Margaret Donovan took over as president of our association. At 55 years old, she arrived promising to raise the standard of the neighborhood. I noticed her glancing at my garden during her morning walks, but I never imagined what was coming next. Margaret wasn't just strict. I found out the hard way that she was willing to double down on the rules to impose her own vision of suburban perfection. It was on an ordinary Tuesday that I found a yellow envelope stuck to my door. Violation notice was printed in red letters. Inside was a formal document claiming that my native flower garden violated the uniform aesthetics of Oakwood Estates, and that I had not submitted the project for prior approval according to item 7.3 of the regulations. The notice, signed by Margaret, gave me 72 hours to completely remove the garden and restore the standard lawn, under penalty of daily fines and possible legal action. Attached to the document were photos of my garden taken from different angles, as if they were documenting a crime. I read the regulation that same night. Item 7.3 mentioned significant landscaping modifications, but a subsection clearly exempted gardens smaller than 150 square feet made up of native species. My garden was 120 square feet. It was within the rules. The next morning, I prepared a folder with everything: a copy of the regulation with the relevant excerpts highlighted, photos of my garden with precise measurements, even scientific articles about the environmental benefits of native plants. I put on my best shirt and knocked on the association's office door. Margaret greeted me with a cold smile. "James, right? Come in." For 20 minutes, I calmly explained every point, showing how my garden was perfectly within the allowed limits. I pointed out the specific subsection about native plants and even offered to reduce the size in case someone interpreted the measurements differently. "You may have all these papers, Mr. Harrison, but I know the spirit of the regulation," she replied, without even looking at my documentation. "Your experiment deviates from the standard of excellence we are establishing. The decision has already been made. The deadline remains the same." I left feeling frustrated, but still believing that dialogue would win. I sent a detailed email to the entire association board, hoping someone would recognize the absurdity of the situation. The 72-hour deadline passed and nothing happened. For a week, I thought common sense had prevailed. Until Saturday morning, when the sound of engines woke me up. From my bedroom window, I saw 3 uniformed men with the Perfect Lawns Inc. logo unloading equipment in front of my house. A truck full of rolled grass was parked on the street. I ran outside, still in my pajamas. "What's going on here?" The supervisor handed me a document. "Landscaping service contract authorized by the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. We're here to remove the non-conforming garden and reinstall the standard lawn." "You can't do this! This is my property!" "Sir, we're only following orders." According to this document, the association has the authority to intervene after the notification period. It's all signed by the president. As we argued, the other 2 men had already started pulling out my plants. I tried to physically stop them, but the supervisor threatened to call the police. I retreated back into the house and immediately called the lawyer I had consulted a few days earlier. From my window, I watched helplessly as they destroyed months of work. But what happened next was something no one could have predicted. After removing all my plants, the team began to dig deeper to prepare the ground for the new grass. They were using a small backhoe when I heard a metallic noise followed by a high-pitched whistle. "Stop! Everybody! Stop!" shouted the supervisor, but it was too late. A jet of water burst from the ground like a geyser, rising high enough to soak the second floor of my house. The backhoe had ruptured the main water line that supplied our entire street. Within minutes, the water turned my garden into a muddy pool that overflowed onto the street. The workers ran around desperately trying to stop the leak, but the pressure was far too strong. Neighbors began coming out of their houses, some filming the scene on their cell phones. Water was already spilling over to adjacent properties and forming a stream down the street. The supervisor shouted into his phone, trying to reach the water company, while I, standing on the porch, watched in astonishment how Margaret's obsession with a perfect lawn had literally exploded in her face. The chaos completely took over our quiet street. Water was gushing out so forcefully, it was forming little whirlpools in the mud, dragging the remains of my garden onto the asphalt. The water company technicians arrived 15 minutes later, their sirens echoing through the neighborhood. 3 men in blue uniforms jumped out of the van and ran to assess the situation while I stayed on the porch, watching that surreal scene. "Who authorized this excavation?" asked the lead technician, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, as his colleagues rushed to find the master record of the water supply. The Perfect Lawn's supervisor, soaked and visibly nervous, held up the document signed by Margaret. "We have authorization from the Homeowners Association. We were simply following orders." "And what about the excavation protocol? Where is the authorization from the water company? The map of the underground pipelines?" The technician flipped through the document with growing disbelief. "You didn't even call the utility marking service?" The supervisor's uncomfortable silence was enough of an answer. At that moment, a police car parked behind the water company truck. 2 officers got out and started assessing the wreckage that used to be my garden, and now looked like a small pond. "Can someone explain what happened here?" asked the younger officer, already holding a notepad. I went down the steps from the porch, feeling the cold water on my ankles. I explained everything, from the unfounded notice up to the arrival of the team without my consent. As I spoke, I handed the folder with all my documentation that I had prepared days earlier, including the section of the regulation that clearly allowed my garden. "Mr. Harrison," said the second officer after reviewing my documents, "it looks like there was a serious abuse of power here. The association cannot simply send people to dig up your property without the proper municipal permits, especially ignoring the safety protocols for excavation." While we talked, more police cars arrived, this time from the Municipal Works Department. An inspector in a suit and yellow helmet started taking photos of the scene and making notes. The technicians finally managed to close the main valve, and the water jet slowly diminished until it stopped completely, leaving behind a muddy crater where my garden had once been. "This pipeline supplies the entire eastern part of the neighborhood," explained the lead technician, now addressing the group of officers and inspectors that had gathered. "We will have to cut the supply for at least 48 hours to make the proper repairs. We're talking about around 60 homes without water." A murmur of discontent ran through the small crowd of neighbors that had gathered on the street. Some already held buckets in their hands, clearly worried about the next few days without water. It was at that moment that I saw Margaret. She parked her silver SUV at the end of the street and walked toward us with determined steps, as if marching into battle. Her normally impassive face now showed a mix of shock and indignation. She wore an impeccable gray suit, completely out of place in that scene of mud and destruction. "What's going on here?" her voice echoed, making everyone turn to look. "Why isn't the excavation finished yet?" The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes shifted between her and the flooded crater. It was the municipal inspector who finally spoke. "Are you in charge of this operation?" he asked, raising his tablet. "Margaret Donovan, president of the Homeowners Association?" "Yes, that's me. And I demand to know why the work is still halted." The inspector adjusted his helmet. "Ms. Donovan, this excavation was carried out without the proper municipal permits. There was no call to mark underground utilities, there is no excavation license, and, from what I can see, there was not even the consent of the property owner. We're facing multiple violations of the municipal code." Margaret blinked a few times as if processing the information. Then her gaze met mine. "This is ridiculous," she declared, ignoring the inspector and addressing me directly. "Your garden clearly violated our rules. As president, I have full authority to ensure the neighborhood meets a certain aesthetic." "Actually, you don't," intervened the older officer as he looked through my documents. "The regulation you mentioned has specific exceptions for native plant gardens below a certain size. Mr. Harrison's garden was completely within the rules." I saw Margaret's face stiffen. She wasn't used to being contradicted, much less by an authority. "That is just a minor technical detail," she shot back, nervously adjusting the golden association pin on her lapel. "The greater good of the community. The greater good of the community now includes 60 houses without water for 2 days," interrupted the water company technician. "Not to mention the emergency repair costs for this main pipeline, which will be charged entirely to the one responsible for the unauthorized excavation." News about the incident spread through the neighborhood as fast as the water had burst from that broken pipeline. While the technicians began the preliminary damage assessment, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Neighbors I barely knew were sending messages of solidarity and outrage. Robert Fletcher, who lived 3 houses down, showed up at my door with water jugs. "James, this is absurd. Margaret has been out of control ever since she took over. Last week she fined the Pattersons because their curtains were the wrong shade of white." Sitting in my living room, we had an impromptu small meeting. Robert, who had always been discreet at community gatherings, was now speaking passionately about how the association had turned into an authoritarian regime under Margaret's leadership. She interpreted the regulation in her own way to justify arbitrary decisions, explained Sophia Lynn, a retired lawyer who rarely showed up at community events. This is precisely the kind of behavior that discredits homeowners associations across the country. As the afternoon progressed, my living room turned into an impromptu operations center. Sophia sorted through the legal documentation while Robert and other neighbors organized a shared document listing all incidents of abuse of power over the last 6 months. Michael Rodriguez, who worked in IT, created an online group to coordinate our efforts. "It's not just about your garden, James," said Michael as he typed furiously on his laptop. "It's about how we want to live in this community. Margaret has a vision of an artificially perfect suburb that completely ignores sustainability and the well-being of the residents." What surprised me most was seeing people I had never talked to before coming into my house to offer support. Eleanor Whitman, a 78-year-old lady who lived on the corner, brought along a photo album documenting what Oakwood Estates was like in the 80s and 90s, with diverse gardens and a less rigid approach to aesthetics. "We built this place to be a community, not a showroom," she said, pointing to the old photos. "There were gardens of all kinds, community gardens. Margaret wants to turn everything into sterile and perfect lawns that no one really uses." In the meantime, some members of the association board also began to speak up. Thomas Jacobson, the treasurer, arrived early in the evening with a worried expression. "I just reviewed our insurance policy," he said, sitting heavily on the sofa. "It does not cover damages caused by unauthorized interventions. And the specific policy for board actions has a clause excluding actions taken without the full council's approval." "Margaret didn't consult the council about this intervention?" I asked, surprised. Thomas shook his head slowly. "There was no vote, no record in the minutes. She simply acted on her own, using the discretionary budget of the presidency to hire the landscaping company." That revelation sparked a new wave of outrage. Patricia Weber, who was the council secretary, arrived shortly after with her tablet. "I have recordings of all the meetings in the last 2 years," she explained, connecting the device to my TV. "In none of them was there any authorization for direct interventions in private properties for minor aesthetic issues." As the evening advanced, our impromptu meeting started taking shape. Sophia Lynn naturally took on the leadership role, organizing the evidence into categories: procedural violations, financial issues, abuse of power, and non-compliance with the regulation itself. What began as a reaction to the incident in my garden was quickly turning into a movement for a complete reform of our association's governance. At one point, well past 9 at night, the doorbell rang again. To my surprise, it was Edward Thompson, the vice president of the association and a traditional ally of Margaret. His face showed clear embarrassment as he entered the crowded room. "I came because I believe we need to resolve this fairly," he said after a moment of awkward silence. "I've lived here for 15 years, and I've never seen our community so divided." Edward explained that he had tried for months to moderate Margaret's behavior, with no success. He admitted that many decisions were taken without his knowledge, despite his position as vice president. "Today's incident was the last straw," he admitted, looking at the notes Sophia had spread on the coffee table. "When I saw the water company technicians and the police, I realized that this had gone way too far." Edward's arrival gave the group new momentum. As an official member of the board, he had the authority to call an extraordinary meeting, bypassing the need for the president's approval. "According to our bylaws, 2 board members are enough to call an emergency assembly," he explained as Thomas nodded in agreement. "We can have a vote of confidence and evaluate the president's conduct." That night, while dozens of homes remained without water and technicians worked under temporary lights to repair the broken pipeline, something deeper was being mended in our community. A sense of common purpose united people who had barely known each other before. Before everyone left, it was well past midnight. Edward and Thomas formally signed the call for an extraordinary assembly, scheduled for 48 hours later, exactly when the water supply was to be restored. Sophia and other volunteers committed to distributing the notice to every home first thing in the morning. When I finally closed the door and was left alone, I looked out the window at what remained of my garden. now a muddy crater surrounded by isolation tape. Ironically, it took Margaret destroying my little green space for the community to finally find its voice. The community hall at Oakwood Estates had never been this full. Even with the air conditioning cranked up, the heat of so many bodies gathered made the room feel suffocating. Extra chairs were hurriedly brought in from storage, yet many people still remained standing along the walls. In my 8 years living here, I had never seen such participation. At the main table, Edward and Thomas organized stacks of documents while Patricia set up the projector. Margaret still hadn't arrived, and the tension was palpable. Some residents talked in small groups. Others were constantly checking their phones and sharing updates in the messaging groups that had popped up in the last 2 days. Right on time at 7 in the evening, Edward tapped the microphone to call everyone to order. He had barely started his introductory speech when the back door opened. Margaret entered, accompanied by a man in a suit carrying a leather folder, probably her lawyer. "I apologize for the delay," she said, walking down the central aisle with her usual stiff posture. "I was finalizing the details of the agreement with the water company. The supply will be restored by tomorrow morning." There were murmurs in the room. Margaret seemed completely oblivious to the hostile atmosphere. She took her seat at the main table as if nothing had happened, adjusting the microphone with precise gestures. "Before we start any discussion about the unfortunate incident," she continued, "I would like to clarify that all actions were taken in the best interest of this community. The association's regulations authorize me to—" "No, they do not." Sophia Lynn's voice cut through the air like a knife. The retired lawyer stood up, holding a printed copy of the bylaws. Page 37, Section 8. 4. Direct interventions in private properties require prior council approval recorded in the minutes, except in emergencies that threaten public safety. Margaret blinked a few times, visibly uncomfortable with the interruption. Her lawyer leaned in to whisper something in her ear. "A garden that does not conform jeopardizes the added value of all properties," she answered, regaining her composure. "This constitutes a collective financial emergency." A wave of incredulous laughter ran through the hall. Edward cleared his throat and resumed control of the meeting. "Let's please keep order. We are here to seriously discuss what happened and its implications. I propose we start with a factual recount of the events followed by a presentation of the damages and incurred costs." Thomas then took the microphone, presenting a chronological sequence of events from the initial notice to the rupture of the pipeline. As he spoke, images appeared on the big screen. The original notice, my garden before the intervention, the broken pipeline, the flooded crater. With each new photo, the murmurs in the room grew louder. "The preliminary costs are as follows," Thomas continued, projecting a detailed spreadsheet. "Emergency repair for the main pipeline, $7,450. Public road damage, $2,300. Emergency water distribution service, $1,870. Municipal fine for unauthorized excavation, $5,000. That totals $16,620, not including the damages to Mr. Harrison's property, which will be evaluated later." Margaret maintained a neutral expression, while her lawyer scribbled furiously on his notepad. "Our insurance policy," Thomas said next, "explicitly excludes coverage for actions not authorized by the full council. Moreover, Perfect Lawns Inc. has already filed a lawsuit against the association, claiming they were not informed about the need for additional permits." That was when Patricia projected the contract signed by Margaret with the landscaping company. A yellow highlighted line caught everyone's attention. "Client declares to have all necessary authorizations for the requested service." "Margaret signed this document stating that we had all the permits," explained Patricia. "But we never requested authorization from the water company or the Public Works Department." Finally, Margaret's lawyer spoke up. "My client acted based on her understanding of her responsibilities. Any procedural error can be corrected without resorting to drastic measures." It was my turn to speak. I walked to the center microphone, feeling every eye on me. I had never been good at public speaking, but the outrage of the last few days had given me an unusual clarity. "This is not just about procedural errors," I began, keeping my voice firm. "This incident reflects a systematic pattern of abuse of power. My garden was completely within the rules we all agreed to follow. I have here complete documentation, including the official measurements and the list of planted species, all native and beneficial to our local ecosystem." I handed the documents to Edward, who displayed them on the projector so everyone could see. "I tried to resolve this the proper way," I continued. "I presented these same documents to Ms. Donovan before any escalation. She refused to even consider them. I wasn't looking for revenge or conflict. I was seeking dialogue. For the first time since I started speaking, I looked directly at Margaret. What happened was not an accident or a misunderstanding. It was the predictable result of a management style that dismisses dialogue and forces personal opinions as if they were community rules. A deep silence filled the hall when I finished. Margaret seemed smaller in her chair, her gaze lost somewhere distant. Her lawyer whispered something again in her ear, but she appeared not to hear. Then, slowly, hands began to raise around the room. One by one, neighbors shared their own experiences with arbitrary notices, questionable fines, and creative interpretations of the regulations. Eleanor talked about how her request to install solar panels was denied 3 times without any proper justification. The Pattersons recounted the fine for their curtains. Michael described how his community composting project was blocked by aesthetic concerns that were never clearly stated. With each new testimony, Margaret seemed to shrink a little more, while her lawyer took more frantic notes. After almost 2 hours of testimony, Edward called for a vote. The proposal was clear. Remove Margaret from the position of president for abuse of power and set up a temporary committee to review both the regulations and the decision-making processes of the association. Everyone in favor of the motion, please raise your hands. The sea of raised hands was almost unanimous. Only Margaret, her lawyer, and 2 elderly residents who had always supported her kept their hands down. Motion approved, Edward declared, his voice mixing relief with solemnity. Margaret Donovan is officially removed as president of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association, effective immediately. Margaret finally seemed to snap out of it. This is absurd, she protested, suddenly standing up. You can't just remove me like that. In fact, we can, replied Sophia, pointing once again to the bylaws. Section 3.2 states, any board member may be removed by a 2/3 vote of those present at an extraordinary meeting. And we had far more than that. And what about the costs? Someone from the back asked. Who is going to pay the more than $16,000? Margaret's lawyer began talking about shared responsibility and limits on personal obligations. But Thomas interrupted. The contract with Perfect Lawns was signed personally by Margaret, not on behalf of the association. She stated that she had permits that she knew she didn't. Legally, that makes her personally responsible. And the association cannot cover that, Edward added. It would be unfair to use everyone's money to cover the costs of a unilateral, unauthorized decision. Margaret grabbed her folder and quickly headed for the exit, with her lawyer hurrying behind her. Before she reached the door, she turned one last time. You are going to regret this. This place will turn into a mess without proper oversight. The silence that followed her departure soon gave way to a collective sense of relief. People started chatting animatedly, some even laughing. It was as if an invisible weight had been lifted. Edward tapped the microphone again. We still have other matters to address. First, we need to elect an interim president until the next regular elections in 3 months. To my surprise, several people pointed at me. James should take over, suggested Robert. He was the one who got hit the hardest by all this. I raised my hands in protest. I appreciate the trust, but I don't think I'm the right person. I'm an engineer, not an administrator. Besides, we need someone with experience on the council. After some discussion, Sophia Lynn was elected interim president, while Edward remained as vice president. As our first official act, Sophia announced, I propose the creation of 2 committees, one to review the regulations, making them clearer and less open to arbitrary interpretations, and another to develop a sustainable gardening program for Oakwood Estates. The proposal was approved unanimously. To my surprise, I was immediately appointed to lead the Sustainable Gardening Committee. Apparently, my little destroyed garden had become a symbol of something much bigger. In the weeks that followed, our community underwent a remarkable transformation. The Regulation Review Committee, led by Patricia, drastically simplified the rules, removing unnecessary restrictions and making the remaining ones more objective and measurable. My committee developed a guide for sustainable gardening, with recommendations on native plants, water conservation techniques, and strategies to attract pollinators. To my surprise, more than 30 households showed interest in converting parts of their lawns into eco-friendly gardens. As for Margaret, we learned that she had put her house up for sale only a week after the assembly. The settlement regarding the repair costs was finally resolved after tense negotiations. She would cover the $16,820 in technical reparations, while the association would take on the costs to restore my garden. At the first regular meeting under the new leadership, we presented a project for a small community garden in an underutilized area near the clubhouse. Eleanor Whitman, the lady who had brought the old photos, cried when she saw that part of the original spirit of Oakwood Estates was being restored. As for my own garden, I decided to expand it a little. With the volunteer help of several neighbors, including some I had hardly known before the incident, we transformed that muddy crater into a vibrant space featuring more than 30 different species of native flowers and shrubs. One Saturday morning, while we were planting the final shrubs, Robert came over with a decorative sign his son had made in woodworking class. On it, carved in dark wood, were the words, "James Garden Community," where a broken water line brought a community together. We laughed together as we stood at the garden's entrance. The hummingbirds had already returned, and a few butterflies danced among the newly planted flowers. What Margaret never understood is that a true community is not defined by the perfect uniformity of its lawns, but by the harmony created by the different expressions each person brings to the shared space. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to get access to more stories like this. When I look out the window now, I don't just see plants and flowers. I see the tangible result of people who learned to value natural diversity as much as human diversity. The broken waterline incident, which started as a disaster, ended up watering something much more valuable than any perfectly trimmed lawn could ever be: a genuine sense of community.